I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we consider the Trump peace plan reportedly being mooted by his staffers, hear live from another vital summit of European leaders, and discuss a shopping list of weapons and permissions Western leaders could action over the next 2 months to support Ukraine. Later, following that missile damage to Kharkiv's iconic Derzhprom building, we do a deeper dive into the impact of this war on Ukrainian heritage.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 8th of November, 2 years and 264 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Europe editor, James Crisp, live on the ground in Budapest, Hungary, and Michael Bohnert from the RAND Corporation in Washington, D.C. First, though, I'll report on the battlefield situation. The overall picture on the front lines remains relatively, always the opportune word when dealing with a war on European soil, static, with no major advances. It would appear that the Pokrovsk sector in Donetsk remains the main focus of Russian forces' attention, with some progress south of what was once considered that important logistics hub. Geolocated footage published yesterday and assessed by the ISW indicates Kremlin forces likely seized Norilov-Siyivska, south of Pokrovsk and west of Seledo. Russian sources credited a motorised battalion of the 80th Tank Regiment with taking control there. Elsewhere, Russian forces continued offensive operations northeast of Kharkiv city near Vovchansk on November 6th and 7th, but didn't advance there either. Likewise, on the Kupiansk-Savatove-Kremina line. In the Kursk salient, fighting continued southeast of Koronevo, just south of Sudza. But again, no changes to the front line. Sudza is that settlement that we heard from Thomas Much from when the first incursion began. Now, there are reports that a recent Russian military assault northeast of Seversk near Bakhmut ended in failure, sparking anger among Russian ultranationalist mill bloggers. They criticised Russian commanders for their decision-making and the broader military culture that they say inflates Russian battlefield successes. The assault, ordered by the commander of the 123rd Motorised Rifle Brigade, involved multiple motorised rifle and tank battalions that lacked sufficient fire support, leading to heavy personnel and equipment losses. Additionally, Russian commanders are believed to have sustained notable casualties in recent combat. Reports indicate that Major General Pavlo Klemenko, commander of the Russian 5th Motorised Rifle Brigade, was killed. Also, in a separate incident, millbloggers report that a sniper platoon deputy commander named Apalkov also died in combat near Chasiv Yar. I think the most noteworthy development overnight was in the drone war, as Ukrainian attack drones reportedly successfully hit Russia's Saratovsky refinery deep inside Russian territory, setting the facility there on fire. Now, as we discussed a few days ago, there were rumours that there were private conversations taking place between Russian and Ukrainian intelligence chiefs about agreeing not to strike infrastructure sites, especially connected to energy. Certainly, there has been something of a lull of late, but after that pause, it would appear that Kyiv's long-range drone campaign against oil infrastructure in particular has restarted. Now, Dom and I touched base this morning. He's in Prague for a major defence conference, which he'll be reporting on next week. But he wonders whether that might possibly be an indication that those talks, if they were real, have broken down. We shall see. Now, staying on the drone war, Zaporizhia has come under considerable bombardment of late, with a death toll overnight reaching 9, including a 1-year-old baby. 15 others are reportedly severely wounded, with a 5-year-old boy fighting for his life. 5 more are described as seriously ill. Now, on the subject of war crimes, which this reportedly was, given that it is attack fundamentally on civilian housing, Ukrainian authorities continue to report systematic Russian executions of Ukrainian POWs, noting a clear increase in such executions. Head of the Department for Combating Crimes Committed in Armed Conflict, that's in the Prosecutor General's office in Ukraine, are investigating 49 criminal cases involving the Russian execution of 124, at least, POWs. The highest numbers of executions occurred in Donetsk Oblast, where Russian forces executed 62 POWs in 17 separate incidents. That's what the authorities allege, followed then by Zaporizhia and then Kharkiv Oblasts. Now, on the North Korean forces now in Europe, Luke Harding at The Guardian has written an interesting dispatch on the Ukrainian troops in Kursk and their reaction to the expectation that they will soon be facing North Koreans in combat. He writes that soldiers holding chunks of that enemy territory in Kursk have been learning Korean phrases and are unconcerned by the threat from reinforcements. The phrases they're learning are hands up, drop your weapon and come to us slowly. That's presumably a reference to North Korean rifles rather than something connected to their alleged fascination with Western pornography, something we were talking about only a matter of days ago. Now, we don't know, this is what the troops are saying, we don't know how Moscow will train them or communicate with them, said one soldier. They might be fanatical professionals with totalitarian souls or just guys lacking experience from another continent. Either way, we're ready. They will just die uselessly. Now, the biggest military-related story of the day, though, is actually political. Today, Putin congratulated Trump on his US election victory and said he was ready to speak with him. I bet he is, describing the Republican leader's campaign trail comments on restoring relations with Russia and ending the Ukraine war as worthy of attention. He said he had normal relations with Trump in the past and would be willing to take his call. That's good of him, or to contact him first. Trump separately told NBC after these comments that I think we will speak. Now, Sergei Shoigu has said that the West must negotiate, though, on the war's end based on current realities. And it would appear that one of the mooted options by the incoming Trump team is considering something along those lines. Now, this is, I think, the most significant story of the day. According to the Wall Street Journal and other reports, Trump may call on European and British troops to enforce an 800-mile buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian armies as part of a plan to freeze the war and the establishment of a demilitarized zone between Russian-held territory and Ukraine. I should emphasise it remains extremely unclear how serious this plan is and whether Trump would fully implement it upon taking office. For at present, of course, neither Russia, which continues its offensive, nor Ukraine, which has said it is unwilling to concede any territory, have signalled a readiness for talks. Details of this plan emerged as Zelensky warned that any attempt to make peace by appeasing Moscow would mean suicide for Europe. Now, the president-elect's plan, outlined by 3 Trump staffers, would see the current front line, as I say, frozen in place and Ukraine agreeing to shelve its ambition to join NATO for 20 years. In exchange, the US would pump Ukraine full of weapons to deter Russia from restarting the war. The US wouldn't contribute troops of its own to patrol and enforce any buffer zone, but European troops would. One of the staffers is quoted as saying, "We can do the training and other support, but the barrel of the gun would be European. We're not sending American men and women to uphold peace, but we are willing to pay for it. Get the Poles, Germans, British and the French to do it." So that is apparently one of the plans that the new Trump administration is mooting, which would mean handing over, of course, Ukrainian territory and millions of Ukrainian citizens to Russia. So as we discussed yesterday and the day before, it will now be up to Europe to decide whether that is a peace it would be willing to accept or whether it must do more, much more, to try and change the military situation. And on that subject, as we advertised yesterday, there is, as we speak, a major meeting of the European political community taking place in Budapest, Hungary. The Telegraph's Europe editor, James Crisp, is there. James, thank you very much for your time. I was expecting it to be chillier there in Eastern Europe, but I was looking at the forecast this morning and it's milder there than in London, at least in literal temperature. But I imagine in terms of the political temperature, it is extremely, extremely frosty indeed, given the situation at the moment. But James, where do you want to start? What are Zelensky and the other Western leaders there saying at this pivotal moment?
Okay, thank you, Francis. Yes, I'm here at the Ferenc Puskás National Football Stadium in Hungary. It's the second day of two summits. Yesterday was the European Political Community Summit. That's of European, as in non-EU and EU leaders. So as well as the EU, Starmer was there, Turkish President Erdogan was there, and many others. About 50 leaders in total for talks which were completely dominated, as you'd expect, by Donald Trump's astonishing comeback and what that would mean for Ukraine and European security. Now, we're in Hungary and the summit's being hosted by Viktor Orban, a very enthusiastic Trump supporter. He endorsed Trump all the way through the election. And he is also, it's fair to say, Putin's closest ally in the EU. At a press conference, which I attended at the end of the summit yesterday, he said that the election had changed everything, that we were entering a new chapter, and that there should be a ceasefire as soon as possible. He said that the number of European countries who were coming round to that point of view was increasing and had increased since Trump's election. Now, he was followed to the podium by President Zelensky, who was asked about that, as you'd expect, and he simply replied no, and said that Mr. Orban was talking nonsense.
Fascinating to hear that rebuttal. Now, I've also been reading, James, this morning, some quite punchy remarks by President Macron about the situation in Europe at the moment. Do you want to talk a little bit about the mood amongst the French camp at the moment?
Sure. Basically, Macron said that Europe is a continent of herbivores in a world populated by carnivores. He said, at the very least, Europe had to be prepared to become an omnivore. Keeping with that kind of food-based analogy, Josep Borrell, the EU's chief diplomat, also called for Europe to do more on common European defence and to bolster arms manufacturing, basically in preparation for the expected Trump withdrawal of support from Ukraine. He said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and the only recipe to deal with this crisis is European unity. So, look, once again, when the EU finds itself faced with a crisis, its go-to answer is more Europe, deeper integration.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And you're going to see that, of course, be at loggerheads with certain other European leaders. And that's before you even get the British perspective on that. James, I'm really interested, generally speaking, in the mood there. Are diplomats surprised by the result in the United States? Was it something they were expecting? Is there optimism? Is there pessimism? The mood in the room, the mood on the ground will be really interesting to hear your perspective on.
Well, look, I think it's fair to say it's no secret that most of the EU would have far preferred a Kamala Harris victory. They do think that basically this means Europe really has to step up to the plate. Now, there's problems with that. Can Europe replace US arms manufacturing? No, it can't. Not at the moment. Now, they talk about, look what we did with the pharmaceutical industry during the pandemic. We ramped up the pharmaceutical industry and became the world's #1 vaccine exporter. We can do that with defense, but it'll take time. Time is one of the things we don't seem to have a lot at the moment. What Europe can do is money. So there will be ways and discussions about how to raise more money to plug this Washington-sized gap. Now, you can get that money in a number of ways. There's talk about doing something with a frozen interest, the interest on frozen Russian assets. EU budget negotiations are expected to happen next year. The EU is actually, when it's faced with a crisis, does have a track record of pulling something out the bag, a fudge or something which always seemed impossible until it suddenly becomes not only possible, but inevitable. They are going to continue to support Ukraine. I think Ukraine is a candidate member to join the EU. There's a lot of leaders who are very politically invested in supporting Ukraine. How are they going to do it? One of the deals which people, diplomats, analysts are talking about, could Europe come up with a load of money and actually buy US weapons to send to Ukraine or to replenish their own stocks while sending back older weapons to Ukraine. That could be sold to Trump as a deal, a win-win. But it's early days, and there are definite sort of questions about how long Europe can support Ukraine in this new scenario. Keir Starmer, yesterday, he met with Zelensky. They had bilateral talks, and he assured the president that Britain would be unwavering in its support of Ukraine. And there is actually an opportunity for Britain really to try and take back that leadership role which has fallen away on Ukraine here, especially given that the German government, the richest EU member state, one of its most influential, has collapsed and is basically engulfed in a domestic political crisis, which doesn't look like at the moment being resolved until March, 2 months after Trump is inaugurated.
Well, that was going to be my next question, James. Is what do you think the impact is going to be of that German government collapse? On the one hand, Germany, of course, has been quite an impediment to a hawkishness in Europe on Ukraine. Whilst they've given a lot of financial support, there have been, of course, other concerns in terms of them not really investing in armament production and their own defence in the way that was initially promised. Are we going to see a positive change as a result of this? Or do you think quite the reverse, that this is just going to delay any possibility of Europe really acting now swiftly in the next 2 months, decisively, as we prepare for Trump's inauguration?
I think it makes things more difficult. I think it saps things. It saps political will. I mean, Germany is the largest exporter of weapons to Ukraine after the United States. The UK is third. So, look, there's no way of hiding it. Olaf Scholz is going to be a very distracted man. The opposition, the CDU, they're waiting in the wings. They're basically a government in waiting, and they're urging him to call the election before March. If that happens, I think Merz, the leader of the CDU, has been far more hawkish on Ukraine. He said that they would send the long-range Taurus missiles to Kyiv. So I think if there's an election soon, a new conservative government comes in, one which is more hawkish on Ukraine, that will actually bolster Europe's response. And they will find willing allies in Poland's Donald Tusk on that. And Macron will continue to at least talk the talk and use this to sort of push his pet project of deeper common European defense, buying European, by which he means mostly French, weapons. But yeah, the collapse of the government couldn't come at a worse time.
Well, thanks, James. Before I bring in Michael here to discuss more deeply about what Europe might do in the granular sense, and indeed the Biden administration, what's next for you over there in Budapest, and what have you got on the itinerary?
Well, I mean, another one of the issues which is being talked about a lot is the threat of Donald Trump hitting the EU with 10% trade tariffs, which would also hit the UK. The reason he's interested in these trade tariffs is he feels that basically Europe runs big trade surplus with the US while freeloading on Washington and getting it to pay for their security. I think what's been interesting as well is Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General. He was here yesterday and was at pains to say, look, we've all increased our defense spending, and that's down to the brilliant leadership of Donald Trump. So there's a lot of flattery going on. There's hope that maybe Giorgia Meloni of Italy could find a mediation role between Trump and the EU. She's very friendly with Elon Musk, and she's been talking about how that could be an added value at the summit today. I think there's clearly a lot of uncertainty. I mean, a lot of people trying to put a positive spin on it will say, look, this is the shock that Europe needs to change itself and wake up to this new reality, start punching its weight on the geopolitical stage. But the EU was basically set up in the 50s to try and prevent smaller European countries being squeezed between the Soviet Union and the United States. Well, now it looks a lot like it's going to be squeezed between between Russia, the United States, and China.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very, very much, James, for your perspective, for dialing in on the ground there. No doubt there'll be more for us to discuss next week with you. And I know you have to dash off now to carry on with your reporting and writing some of this up for the paper. So thank you very much for your time. I'm thrilled, though, to bring in now Michael Bohnert from the RAND Corporation in Washington. Michael, always a pleasure to have you on. Now, whenever we do, it's usually to talk about the same issue, but it seems particularly important now we've had that result in the United States, which is, of course, around weapons procurement, what is available, what might be done from both the American and the European perspective, if the political will was there. But let's start, first of all, if I may, Michael, with the United States and the Biden administration. There's been much talk, as I discussed yesterday on the podcast, Trump's win, meaning that the Biden administration are immediately now trying to think very quickly about what they might do in terms of giving vital support over the next 2 months, which Trump would not be able to block in the worst case scenarios. Money's being talked about a lot, as well as, of course, the assistance that it can provide. But what can it actually feasibly do? There's obviously weapons permissions, Michael, but in terms of the material, what can it feasibly do in that 2 months if the will was there? And it's a big if. Michael Bohnert.
Yeah, so first off, thank you for having me on the pod, Francis. The truth is, in 2 months or less, there's not a lot you can do. And additionally, Washington tends to shut down the latter half of December anyway. So really, it's all decisions and movement that have to happen over the next month. What I will say is the things to focus on, if you are worried about aid not coming, are the things that are the hardest to source from outside the U.S. And those are air defense missiles and long-range strike. So we're talking about, for air defense, the Patriot missiles that are called AMRAAM and Sidewinder. Those are the kind of primary ones, anything you hear Frankensams, etc. And then the long-range strike. So the missiles known as ATACMS and the multiple launch referred to as GIMLRs. Those kind of 5 to 6 systems are the ones that there's the least capacity outside of the U.S. to produce, and they're very expensive. That $6 billion chunk that's floated around of what's available, that goes pretty far with drawing those down from U.S. stocks. It's something that is a bit of a risk from a domestic perspective, but given that production is still ramping up of those, it's a very short-term risk for the U.S. But that's something that those can be moved. They're relatively small compared to tanks in that logistics chain. But the focus should be on air defense and strike of that $6 billion. Everything else can be made up when you look at the global supply chains, but the air defense and strike are the only things that really should be focused on at this time.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Michael. Now, we had a question from Alistair on X yesterday, which is relevant to something that James was just talking about. And the question was, we've seen the US delaying approval for deliveries to Ukraine like Swedish AWACS and prohibiting Ukraine from striking Russia with SS. If Europe were to buy US arms, could Trump change this policy? Or is it actually down to ITAR regulations? Now, I know that's very granular for some listeners, but basically it's the degree to which permissions are required from the United States, and that even if weapons were procured, that those permissions might still be able to be not granted. So you'd have the weapons, but you weren't able to legally use them. So where would you answer that, Michael?
So that comes down heavily to the contracting. I mean, ITAR is a fuzzy set of rules and regulations. There's a large defense missile list and defense services list that's included, but the ability to re-export, etc., can all be placed into contracts in terms of use. It's that ITAR, think of it as almost like a standardized blanket set of governance for what can and can't be sold, but those things can always be carved out under special contracts. So that's something where really it's up to the discretion of the government. It primarily falls under State Department and State Department rules and regulations. So that's more executive than legislative and how that can be handled. There are other checks and policies of who has stamp authority, but ultimately the executive branch can grant changes to that.
So would it be fair to say, Michael, and I know I'm really simplifying as being a very, very complicated subject here, but would it be possible for Europe to buy US arms now, hastily, or at least, let's say, over the next 6 months, but for a Trump administration White House to say, sorry, you got them, you've bought them, but you can't use them. Is that fair?
So yes, the only caveat I want to put on that is any purchases of U.S. systems, none of them would arrive within really the next 6 months because the production lines are full. So even if new production was made, I wouldn't expect anything to arrive for a year. So that almost makes the first point moot just because of that restriction.
Yeah, well, this again speaks to why it was so urgent for Europe to be preparing for this eventuality a year or more ago, something we were talking about, of course, at the time. But let's go to Europe then now more explicitly, Michael. Let's imagine, therefore, that Europe does decide to buy these weapons, and let's just say that the Trump White House would be willing to give these requisite permissions. What do you think would be on that purchasing list? What could be a plan, let's say, that fulfills what Ukraine is asking for and indeed is being filled by Europe and not the United States? What could be done?
So there's things you can do in the short term and things that you can do in the long term. So what I will say is Europe really only has one alternative to Patriot. It's relatively low production. That's the Franco-Italian Aster missile and SAM-T system. They provided a few to Ukraine. The production has been ramping up, not to the levels necessary, but if Europe were to push for greater production of that, they do have stockpiles of those in the navies of UK as well, where they can draw on to fill the gap. So that is something to provide a way to help stretch out that Patriot line. I'm going to go through the categories of things to defend. Looking at glide bombs, there's really not many options for Europeans to produce anti-glide bomb weapons. There aren't really many long-range options to stop the fighters. You either have to hit the Russian fighters in the air or the ground. Swedish Gripens and Meteor missiles, those both can have ramp-ups, but providing that now would give Ukraine a capability to stop some of those fighters. The Meteor missiles are the longest range in Europe's inventory. They're designed for this fight. Where Europe has a pretty good opportunity to help, though, is actually in the anti-cruise missile and drone defense. So something that we haven't seen a lot of, but has been introduced, are using repurposing missiles. So there are these old 2 3/4 inch or 70 millimeter rockets. Dom could probably talk about how he used them back in the day. They're originally for helicopters. However, they've been modified to shoot down drones. These are made in very high volumes. Thales in France and the Netherlands, there's Canadian companies. These are produced in quantities of tens of thousands, but the heads to convert them to shooting down drones are relatively new for European producers. But there are stocks, and that's something that can be drawn upon. What's interesting is the sensors for those are very similar to sensors used for autonomous vehicles and for those systems. So this is where thinking Volkswagen with factories that are shutting down, etc., there are opportunities to ramp up to use existing systems and repurpose them in the short term. And those you could start seeing within a couple months, given that the hard parts, those rocket motors, are already there. So that'd be retooling a design, but that would be a major step into helping Ukraine with defense, is these 70 millimeter rockets. So I know that's very detailed, but it's something that hasn't really been tapped yet, where Europe could actually provide a lot of capacity for Ukraine. So another part is on the electronic warfare for drone defense. So most of the electronic warfare systems are relatively basic that are being fielded. Batteries, a very small controller that's even simpler than a smartphone, and antennas. European companies could definitely produce those in high numbers. One thing that's tricky is those become obsolete every 4 to 12 weeks. So that would be a case of European companies would basically be subcontracting to Ukrainian firms and producing subcomponents. Now, one comment on that front is when we've spoken with Ukrainian contractors, they've always said they're cash limited, they're not production limited. They could easily up their production 2 to 3 times with a cash infusion. So that's something that Europe could do very quickly, is for the Ukrainian firm making electronic warfare, immediately give them cash while filling out a broader defense base. And on both of these topics, one thing that Ukrainians are always pressing is delivering on time in small quantities is better than big quantities, but you don't know when. So this is where providing trucks to make sure weapons get to places on time is critical, and getting that truck logistics through Europe to be faster is very important. But on the air defense side, there are actually a few options where Europe can provide a lot of capacity, albeit of much lower capability systems, but a lot of capacity very quickly. So there are any questions on air defense before we move on?
Thanks, Michael. Now, I know this is extremely granular, extremely detailed, but it really, really matters. When we talk about what Europe can do, this is what this actually means in a meaningful sense, beyond the imprecise statements one often hears politicians and experts say. And I know we have a lot of listeners in positions of influence who might indeed be involved in the procurement of some of the things talked about today. So, Michael, thank you. Please carry on.
I mean, this is your time to shine, leaders. And when I've talked to leaders, Francis, I give them a very similar list. So this isn't like new. This has been put together for a while. I will say there are a lot of other ramp-ups that are happening with missiles like IRIS-T, CAM, Mica, etc. throughout Europe. And these are going to have to be, these can't just be produced in the UK and France and Italy. They're going to have to be produced in Romania, Poland, across the whole area. Because something I've touched on before is most munitions in the major European economies aren't built near people. They're built away from people. So it's also hard to get the workers into the right regions, where some of the more industrialized parts of Europe that are a little less well off have a better capacity to ramp up. And that's a whole other topic for another time, Francis, on the how to actually do this. But the next topic is really artillery. Now, Europe has been behind the curve in ramping up artillery production. They keep on starting later. The contracting keeps on being slower. It's taking more and more time. This is a case where in the interim, I mean, even what we've heard is from the Czech initiative, while there's a lot of pledges, the money's sometimes slow. So as the ramp up in Europe continues to increase and more money will need to be thrown at that, this is the case where Europe's just going to have to write checks in the interim. South Korea, Japan, Turkey, Pakistan, and India are major sources that are available. Normally places like South Africa aren't providing. Brazil has been waffling. So looking at it, those are going to be major suppliers for artillery, both of the standard tube style, we think of cannons, as well as rocket artillery and ballistic missiles that currently the US provides. For Europe Europe has no real domestic production of rocket artillery, things like those ATACMS, things for the HIMARS. Some are starting, but they're behind schedule, and there's nothing that really can come for those in the next couple of months, if not a year. So this is the case where defense sovereignty within the within the Euro theater is just not practical in the short term. European countries are just going to have to write lots of checks. And I hate to say that because no one likes hearing that, but there is no option to provide those in Europe right now.
So, Michael, if we're trying to tie all of this together, imagining the worst case scenarios, and again, I keep emphasizing that because we don't know what's going to happen when the Trump camp comes into office in January. But in the worst case scenario, we could be in a situation where Europe wants to place arms orders that it isn't going to receive, specifically from the United States, for over a year. And that assumes that the war is still ongoing, and it also assumes that the Trump camp would be willing to say, yes, you can buy these weapons and indeed use them, with the permission essentially being granted from the very top. So that's a big if. And then we've got all of these procurement issues and challenges which Europe can do, but feasibly it's going to be expensive, and it's also going to be something that cannot be necessarily ramped up immediately. Is that fair? Is there much room for optimism in that space that you've just built there, as it were?
The good news is my next two topics are actually bright points that Europe could do very quickly, but it's not what's been talked about a lot and is not terribly traditional. So for those traditional systems, the heavy air defense, outside of that one that I mentioned, those new light rockets that could be brought on quickly, and the strike, one place where Europe has a lot of capacity to help is on the drone front. However, one of the reasons Ukraine has been able to stay in the fight is they've been using drones with relatively few safety measures. Western drones are very expensive. We're talking 20 to 100 times more expensive than their Ukrainian counterparts because they have safety after safety after safety. And that works fine when you're trying to go for low collateral damage. But in a major conflict zone where the fight is everything is dangerous in an area, those safeties aren't needed. So I know there might be some questions of whether or not Finnish drones can be sent to Ukraine. But where European companies can help ramp up very quickly is by providing specific components and ramping up component production. So for instance, cameras for drones, batteries for drones, the controllers for drones, the bodies and motors, all of those bits and pieces, even if they're only assembled in Ukraine, many of those components are already sourced. They're just not being used for defense. I mentioned a lot of the cameras for vehicles. That supply chain can be diverted and ramped up. There's a lot of those capabilities to help with the strike drones and the local drones. I mean, it would be one thing though is Europe's going to have to be willing to let Ukraine hit industrial targets en masse. Now the advantage of drones though is because they use smaller warheads, if they miss, they do less damage to the surrounding area. So in many ways it's safer to use a lot of drones than a couple big missiles. But realistically, the letting European firms and paying the firms to subcontract to Ukrainian drone producers and do licensed production is something, Francis, that Europe could do in short order to get to rapidly increase Ukrainian drone capabilities. So there's a lot of details and nuance of exactly the systems. I mentioned a couple of them, but I do think that's a case where Europe can really, really ramp up quickly and really help. And that doesn't rely on any one company or country. That literally is the case of just subcontracting Ukrainian firms, but with Europeans footing the bill.
So that's one of the areas where there's room for optimism, or more optimism, should I say. You said there were two. What's the other?
So the other is, no one talks about it, but the Ukrainian military is still really short on infantry equipment. So outside of Hamish always talking about the need for gas masks, which the UK, of course, is a major supplier, gas masks would help a lot. Medical kits, body armor, winter clothing and gear, night vision goggles, those sorts of small body armor, human protection, really matter a lot. And Ukraine still has not fully outfitted their troops with the most modern equipment. Additionally, small arms like shotguns, grenades, mortars, all of that classic infantry equipment is still in low supply. Ukraine uses it very quickly. They just said they're calling up another 160,000 conscripts, but they don't necessarily have the equipment for all of them. Well, all of these bits and pieces are made extensively throughout Europe, but they haven't had the contracts placed to them. They haven't been exercised as an industry. But all of those can be ramped up pretty quickly. So, for instance, shotguns and countering drones. It's hard, but it actually is possible with some of the better modern systems. Mortars and grenades. Those are things that help troops from being exposed to drones. And then the body armor and med kits are just important because of the high levels of attrition. So with the drones and more modernized and heavier duty infantry equipment, Europe can provide a lot of capability to increase the lethality of Ukrainian ground troops and to make them safer and protected. But one thing needs to be clear. All of these things need to be paired with a willingness to let Ukraine hit energy infrastructure and production facilities that are directly supporting and airfields that are all directly supporting the war effort. Ukraine needs to be able to suppress Russia's ability to produce and Russia's ability to strike. And two of the four categories I mentioned help with that greatly. And so we need to make sure that Europe is willing to provide permissions as well.
Well, Michael, thank you. I feel like we've just sat in the kind of briefing that world leaders receive. So interesting and important in terms of these conversations that are being had right now as we speak about what Europe can do in the worst case scenarios. I would add as well that what we've not talked about, which is worth saying, is if Europe were to define what its red lines were politically before it would, say, intervene in the worst case scenarios, such as an impending collapse of the Ukrainian state, state, then that also might be seen as hugely beneficial for the Ukrainian cause. So it is not just weapons gaps that can be filled. There are political gaps, political questions. But again, it's all a question of willpower. And we've not really seen willpower and leadership for arguably the best part of 2 years now in terms of a clear strategy about what the West wants to actually achieve in Ukraine, whether that be Russian defeat or a frozen conflict and just the survival of the Ukrainian state. But Michael, let's go to our final thoughts now. Is there anything that we've not talked about today that you think should be on our listeners' minds?
So my last final thought on that one was looking at the energy grid last time I was on, and we're starting to see cracks develop there. I think outside of Robin Brooks and a few other researchers that look at sanctions, and you've talked about it on the pod as well, but really stopping this flow of transshipments through the Central Asian states is really where the Europeans can make the biggest impact. Germany and other countries are still, turning a blind eye and letting things be shipped through Central Asia. If that were to stop, many of the critical tooling and other parts that are keeping the war machine functioning are being sent through this back door. And that is the best way to stop the Russian war machine, is to stop the transshipments of goods leaving Europe and going through Central Asia. That should be frankly the number one priority right now, is that yes, all the ramp up's important, but if you don't stop the flow of that industrial support, it's not going to matter. Because I think, as you mentioned, from political will, Russia's throwing a lot more at ramping up than Europe. I still think all the things I said need to have money thrown at them, but stopping that flow of sanctioned goods should be a major priority.
Ievgeniia Gubkina is a Ukrainian architect, architectural and urban historian, and curator who focuses on 20th century architecture and urban planning. After the full-scale invasion, she was forced to flee her hometown of Kharkiv and is now a lecturer at the Bartlett School of Architecture at University College London. While at a conference abroad, she spoke to me about the cost of this war on Ukraine's cultural heritage and what approaches the country might adapt to the recovery of what is lost. This is our conversation on an often missed part of this terrible conflict. Ievgeniia, thank you so much for your time. Last week, Dom was hosting the podcast and reported on the attack on Kharkiv's Derzhprom building, a historic building for the entirety of Ukraine and particularly for that city. Can you start for us by just laying out the significance symbolically and architecturally of that structure, please?
So definitely, actually, if we look at Kharkiv history, Derzhprom is one of the most important buildings which symbolize strength of Kharkiv and at the same time the progress of modernist school of Kharkiv, which developed maybe the golden age of the culture in this city and even in the whole Soviet Ukraine in 1920s, 1930s. So I would say that maybe even if we talk a bit more personal level, or if we talk about just ordinary people from Kharkiv, for them, Derzhprom maybe is the most significant building. Even actually that looks quite brutal because it's concrete and it's gray, it's minimalistic, it's so-called constructivist style. But anyway, people understood this building as the most important building, the building which would maybe represents Kharkiv worldwide.
Interesting. And as you say, it is built of reinforced concrete. And I believe that the Germans tried to destroy it during the occupation, but it didn't even crack, hence how strong it is. But of course, we have seen that it's been damaged by modern missile technology, hence why we were reporting on it. What is its place then in architectural history for Ukraine, beyond its symbolic significance for the city itself?
So let's start maybe from the very beginning. In 1925 was the decision to develop a new center in Kiev in the 20th century. That was quite a usual approach, actually, and usually is connected with some ambitious plans of architects, especially if we talk about modernist heritage. heritage, and especially if we talk about quite radical leftist heritage of 1920s, 1930s in Soviet Union and in Soviet Ukraine. So according to this, it should be new governmental center, and like the second heart or the second, not instead of old center, but actually they should work together, like double center system of the city. In this complex of 3 or even 5 buildings, which we now can actually still see in Kharkiv, and that is the Square of Freedom. Derzhprom was the best one, the most significant one. So we can say that this building and its architecture very interesting and very innovative and unique, represents very particular time in culture, in political life of Ukraine, but at the same time, maybe the philosophical interpretation of what is power exactly of Soviet Ukraine in 1920s, 1930s. And for me, the most important way of thinking about this building is to understand that it was new economical politics period, so something like the mix between capitalism and socialism before common administrative systems. And it was a period in political history which was called national communism. And that structure and visual language of the building represents the main principles of new economical politics and the national communism. You might see 3 rows of horizontal bridges which connects 3 blocks of buildings. This horizontality is quite interesting because it's something really about social democracy in space. At the same time, all the principles Soviet constructivism, but at the same time, there is a part of a modern international style. And we can immediately recognize flat roofs. It was quite innovative because it was quite difficult in those times to build and to construct such a huge concrete structure. Another thing is how all this works together within the complex of Freedom Square. So all this is very administrative center and very important. There is definitely some place of power from which Ukrainian new power should manage the whole the country within the different functions like state industriality and, for example, the House of Cooperation.
Fascinating. Well, I think you've really articulately explained why it matters so much historically and indeed for present Ukraine, modern Ukraine. So let's broaden out the conversation then. Of course, you're an expert on Ukrainian architecture and its heritage more broadly. Of course, one of the great consequences of war, as we've seen not only in this conflict but throughout the 20th century, is the cost on architecture and on buildings, not just the people in them, but indeed whole skylines changed, transformed, whole towns destroyed, whole cities indeed destroyed. So speaking as an architect, as an architectural historian, what has been the architectural consequence of this war?
So if we talk about heritage, that is usual division in heritage studies to movable and immovable heritage. That is a very problematic thing that we actually can't move architecture. Architecture would be where it was. It's not museum assets. It's not something that can be evacuated, which usually we are treated as something stable and something that can't be destroyed. That would be even after our death there. During wars, conflicts, and disasters appeared as the most vulnerable. So, unfortunately, the problem is not only in the destruction of heritage, but in general built environment. For example, such cities as Bohnert or Vovchansk, they completely destroyed. So, urbicide is something that is the extremal and huge problem of contemporary world because of wars and because of lack of punishment. Actually, because of destruction, heritage, built environment is a part of genocidal convention. And unfortunately, it was clearly never applied. We had only one precedent when someone who destroyed, for example, UNESCO historical site, World Heritage Site, was punished and sentenced for the destruction of heritage. So even after Sarajevo, Milosevic was never punished for the destruction of heritage. So it's a huge global problem of doing nothing in this sphere. So impact on Ukrainian architectural heritage. Definitely, we lost a lot of historical sites. For example, in Kharkiv, we definitely should understand that Ukraine is a huge country, and the most vulnerable regions, they are in the eastern or in southern part of Ukraine. In Kharkiv, we already lost, I would say, at least nearly 50 heritage sites which were connected with the so-called interwar modernist style. One of the most significant one, it was the Palace of Railway Workers, which was nearly completely destroyed. Any book on international interwar modernism, you would find this building there, as well as the Derzhprom building. So now the Derzhprom building is already hit by guided air bomb. And at the same time, the Derzhprom for many years have been on a temporary list of UNESCO World Heritage, but it's still not in a permanent list. It's still not the actually World Heritage site. That is a very big problem, and it's something that is quite manageable for such strong and quite visible institutions like UNESCO or the UN. It's just a question of voting. Another problem is that who should vote, because the Russian Federation delegation is still there, and they still can veto and not actually allow us to have more heritage sites. Yes, it has some specific protection status, because 1 year ago, UNESCO established some new list of objects under specific protection. But what does it mean, actually? Especially if we talk about reparations or future punishment or future international law court cases.
That's really interesting. And of course, after the Second World War, many settlements were completely rebuilt as they were prior to the war. Others were, in a sense, constructed in a postmodernist or a modernist style in the 1950s, and indeed similar approaches of those two alternatives were adopted after Yugoslavia's conflicts as well in the Balkans. So I wonder, what's your instinct about what will happen in Ukraine once the war is over? Do you think there will be an effort to rebuild things as they were when it comes to these architectural sites, or do you think they are lost forever?
So first of all, we should base our decisions actually on legislation framework of Ukraine, and according to which we actually should rebuild heritage sites which were listed on a national or regional list of heritage objects as they go. It's how law works in Ukraine. That's why sometimes it's quite problematic if we take into consideration, for example, two sites which were damaged by Russian aggression. All of them, they have the highest rank of heritage status in Ukraine, according to our law, which means that you can do actually not so much. At the same time, we should again understand that the war is not over, and each day there is 20 explosions or more. So that's why, of course, Western media is not so interested in Ukraine anymore, and they are very tired of this information. And for example, being here right now, taking part in World Urban Forum, and all the talks on Ukraine is only about reconstruction. And it feels like people really think that it's fine and the war is over. And we can't reconstruct when missiles just in the skies. It's just impossible. We need actually protection of our cities, because only Kiev and a bit of Odessa has protection systems for anti-missile systems. And Kharkiv is just absolutely naked and vulnerable, just in front of Russian front line. We need to give people hope. We need to give to architects to develop their new thoughts and some response to wars and conflicts. But if we think about people and put people's interests in the center, we should first protect cities and then start thinking about rebuilding and about future. Because what is going on right now, that is not the situation which would allow to build anything. This is the situation actually allowed to protect heritage. So from legal point of view, we have a lot of problems. From military point of view, we have not enough systems to protect our cities and our civilians. And then, of course, another, maybe like the 8th or 10th question about different concepts of responding to wars and conflicts. We stuck in maybe only two concepts, whether we should just demolish everything with bulldozers and then build some new beautiful modernist cities in the way how actually a lot of cities rebuilt after the Second World War, like Rotterdam or Eastern Berlin, as Rotterdam, for example, is again quite problematic because otherwise we would make the second wave of violence against cities and we would make another wave of erasure of historical sites and memories of people and so on. Or we should rebuild everything as it was. Of course, both concepts, they're quite problematic because even if you try to rebuild everything what it was, it's still just an illusion or decoration. For example, Dresden reconstruction was deeply criticized maybe for decades. Another concept of very modernist city which should be built from the scratch. So maybe it should be somewhere in between. And I really remember the discussion, quite postmodernist discussion of 1990s and quite neoliberal discussion, what shall we do? Because these two concepts, they definitely are not applicable anymore, even for 1991, 1993. After especially the siege of Sarajevo, it was a lot of such talks in community of architects. For example, Woods, quite famous actually, deconstructivist architect, he suggested to find some new way to think about traumatic experiences and to preserve all these cracks, all these holes, but at the same time it was still quite problematic. I think that a lot of people, architects, politicians, economists, intellectuals, they should first visit a site before building some conceptions. Otherwise it would be some respectful behavior. I visited Kharkiv in summer at Saltivka district, one of the most damaged mass housing panel prefabricated districts and residential areas in Ukraine, because it's in the front line. I asked people whether they want to demolish these ugly gray panel prefab buildings or they want everything new. And for me, it would be interesting to work with some traumatic experiences and to heal through this, to use architecture as some kind of transitional object for our process of actually recovering from all the traumatic experiences of war. But people actually said that they want everything to be rebuilt as it was. And again, whose interest and whose decisions we should put in the center, that is the question. And maybe for our architectural discussions from one generation to another generation, it would be great if our generation of architects finally would give opportunity to make decisions to people. So in such moment when people went through such traumatic experiences and they lost their homes, it would be great to give them not only voice, very passive voice, but actually to give them opportunity to decide.
It's so interesting hearing that perspective on what should be done after the war. Is there anything that we haven't talked about here, or that when we're talking about conversations around architecture or reconstruction, that is really not on the agenda, that is on your mind, as it were, but is not on the minds of politicians and other people reflecting on this conflict?
It's quite often when we talk about architecture that it's all about someone else's projections. So, of course, that is all about some fantasies, what people need. But there is another question, who actually ask people and how they ask people. We talk a lot about participatory approach. And right here, right now, that is simultaneously in few rooms, people talk about participatory approach in cities. But at the same time, in the third room, that is still the Moscow delegation from Russia, even here within the framework of the UN Habitat. So who will make decisions? It's really very important because it's again about power. And whatever we design, whatever we invent, even if it's not something that matches actually people's real needs or their expectations, there is something very much dramatic about war in general, that actually all this was already pre-designed by Russian bombs. Even Sir Norman Foster, even you, me, even the nice old lady from Saltivka district, unfortunately, would never fully recover from what was pre-designed by Russian bombs. It's something about very deep traumas that would stay with Ukrainians forever. And We need to find ways how to deal with this. And it would be very much inappropriate, actually, in such a moment of working with trauma, to ignore, again, exactly this very traumatized people. That's why I would really dream about the moment when we can empower these people who went through such a terrible things. Because what they shared with me, definitely they need this kind of therapy through architecture. They are very powerful people. I think they deserve to decide.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We're also giving university students globally unlimited access to The Telegraph, completely free of charge. Just visit www.telegraph.co.uk/student-sub. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.